Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial, we'll be creating a wide variety of text effects using a combination of 3D stroke from Trapcode and a couple effects from Red Giant Universe. So let's dive right in. Right here, I've got some text that I've laid out using one of my favorite typefaces, which is called Lust Script, and this is available from your Creative Cloud type kit. Now I've done a little bit of creative arrangement with my type here, bumped up the sizes of the S and the L of these two words, and I also dropped the L down a little bit so that it aligns with the top of this I. In this example, I'll be working with a pre-composed version of this text. So over here in my main comp, this is where I'll be working, and I have my text inside a comp here. Now the reason I'll be doing this is because I'm going to be applying an effect, which is the ramp. And I'll not use the standard After Effects ramp, but I like using the Red Giant Universe 3-color ramp. I think it's a lot more interesting of a result when we're trying to create texture and color on something like this, and we can add more than just 2 different colors. So I'll have this go from having of a red through a yellow, and then maybe down here at the bottom, it'll go to kind of a darkish purple, hinting at red almost. Just change this angle a little bit here. To this, I'd like to add some reflections that appear in the face of the text, sort of like there's a horizon reflection or reflection card or reflection flag that's creating some variation in the text. To do this, I'll use an After Effects shape layer. So I'll go up here to my rectangle tool, and I'm setting this to use a linear gradient as its fill rather than the default solid color. And the reason I want to do this is because I'll use this gradient to have this reflection fall off. So right now it's going left to right, and I want this to go top to bottom. So this black area, I basically will get rid of using a screen blending mode, and this allows me to define the area of the reflection. So let's set this one to screen. So I'll label my layer here. This will be the reflection. In fact, I'll make 2 of these, so this will be reflection number 1. Now maybe I want to add a little bit of an angle to this, and I want to punch this out in the shape of that text. So I'll use a set matte for this. Now the cool thing about the way shape layers render is that even if I rotate things, the order in which things are rendered is such that the effects are going to be rendered after the transformation of the shape layer. So if I say take the matte from the main text, this is going to be punched out from the text, and I can still kind of move this around and rotate it. If I were using a solid, it wouldn't be working like this. Now next, I'm going to create some distortion in this and sort of rippling and having this reflection bend around the shape of this text. And to do this, I'll use one other really cool Red Giant Universe plugin called Prism Displacement. At the heart of Prism Displacement is something that turns the displacement source that you feed it into a normal map. And then that normal map is used to distort and create these lighting and refraction effects. I'm going to bring this way down. In fact, let's zoom in here a little bit so we can see this. As I bring this down to 0, this should flatten out. Now if I bring this to a negative direction, we'll see these sort of bend upward. Now built into Prism Displacement is a softening filter that takes that input and blurs it before it applies the distortion. And basically this saves you a step, or actually a few steps, if you'd like to soften what is being sent to the displacement without having to go in and pre-compose and add additional effects on your main text. This saves you some time. This is built right into the plugin. Also built into the plugin are things like black and white level adjustments, as well as a gamma adjustment, and individual red, green, and blue channel color strengths here. So if I change these, we can see that each channel is refracting differently. Now, if you'd like that color separation to go away, you can simply set all these to a value of 1. So if I move this up and down, we'll have this nice reflection sweeping through our text. I'll probably want to turn down the transparency of this a little bit. And again, don't forget we have that gradient on here so we can control where that reflection ends. Now I'll make a second version of this simply by duplicating it, and we'll put another one down here on that second line of text. So let's get to the 3D stroke part of this. So I'll open this up, and what we need to do is turn this text, or make a copy of it that has masks instead of the native After Effects text. So I can right click on this, go to create masks, not shapes, but masks from the text. This creates a duplicate with a solid, and on this solid there's a bunch of masks on here. And that's what we need. So I'll take this, copy this. It doesn't matter which layer I turn on, these are identical. I'll paste this in our layer here, and this can be distracting seeing all these different masks here, so I'll go down here and toggle this mask visibility off for now. So the first effect I'm going to add is a sort of edge stroke. Now everything I do here is basically me experimenting and trying different things. I encourage you, as you go along and follow along and use them as your own, is to try all different kinds of things, because you'll actually be surprised at what can end up working out and working fairly well. In the case of this 3D stroke, I'm going to make this thickness, let's say about 3, and then I'm going to turn on the tapering so that rather than just having a stroke around everything, this will actually have some variation in its thickness. Let's take a close look at this E and this C. Where it starts to draw that stroke is actually based on the first vertex of the mask. You can change that first vertex, especially in this case where this E and this C look pretty different in terms of where the stroke is drawing. So over on this C, and let me move this over, right click and select mask and shape path and select set first vertex. So as you can see, that first vertex is the one that is circled. All right, so let's get in here, change this color. I'll add maybe something that's a little bit blue. Perhaps set a different blending mode. In fact, don't be afraid to turn up this thickness. Maybe I'll turn this up to a little over 5. So now I'd like to create that extrusion shadow effect. I'll take this layer here, duplicate it, and rename this one Extrusion Shadow, and bring this down to the bottom. I'll solo this layer and reset it. So this thickness I'll leave fairly low at 2, and then go down to the repeater, and I will check enable. Now, by default, it uses this symmetric doubler. I want to turn that off. I just basically want these moving away from the camera. Now, down here, we have a Z displacement. This is displacing each repetition, or clone, we could call it, 30 pixels. And I'll set this to, let's say, 3 for now. And I'll also add X and Y displacement of, let's say, about 2. We basically just want a very small displacement for each repetition, and then we're going to make a bunch of repetitions. So let's say I set this to 36. I don't like the white color here, so let's change this to something interesting, this purple. It's something that has contrast from the base color that we're using of the text. So this is a fairly solid shadow that we've got right now. In our repeater section, we've got this opacity control, and this, like all the others, is the relative change in opacity as we create more and more repetitions. And this will be compounded as they repeat. So this doesn't need to change a whole lot to create some fairly dramatic opacity changes. So I'll set that opacity just to 92. And you can see that this is now starting to feather out. Now, although I am starting to have these fade out over the repetitions from the repeater, the initial opacity is still basically 100%. So if I'd like to scale that down to have a little bit more semi-transparency in this shadow, I can do that. I need to go to the advanced section here and adjust this internal opacity right here. So I'll set this to 50%. And we'll see that this is greatly reduced. And we start to see a lot more detail in that shadow. Again, it depends on the kind of look that you're going for. I really like this sort of detailed extrusion shadow look that we get by lowering this internal opacity quite a bit. Now there's some really interesting stuff going on in this advanced section that doesn't get touched a whole lot. So let's show you some variations with this. Inside the advanced section, we have this low alpha hue rotation. Now, what this is ability to change the stroke color as the alpha channel, or the transparency, decreases. So down here we have a low alpha channel, and up here we have a higher alpha channel. So here we have the ability to shift the hue of each stroke as the alpha gets lower and lower. So this can create some very interesting color combinations. Let's say I set this to a -180, so this is going to start at purple and then shift in a negative direction that color towards blue. Now at this point, you might be wondering, what happens if I want to change this text? Let's say the client comes in and say, I hate that font. I want it to be Helvetica or whatever. Now, I don't want to say this is easy to change, but it is a couple steps. And let me just show you probably the easiest way to do this. So let's go back into our text here. I'm just going to make a duplicate so I always have that original here. Let's say the client comes in and say, oh, no, we have to use Alt Gothic. Okay, so we can use Alt Gothic. Again, this is part of the type kit, so you'll be able to use this one as well. Set this to all caps. Maybe I'll make this first line a little smaller, add a little bit of space between these two. So at this point, the challenge is that we've laid everything out using masks. And if I go back over to my main comp, this doesn't really ripple out in terms of the changes because we've kind of rooted two of these layers in the masks. So let's delete this one. Again, let's create our masks from the text. And all we really need to do is replace those masks with these new set of masks. So right here, I'm just going to select all these. Select that top one, hold down Shift, select the bottom one, and copy that. Now let's go back to our main comp here. Let's solo this one. So this way, we can keep all the settings and everything the same. We're just going to remove the masks, delete those masks, and paste the new ones. There's our new text there. And let's go down here, select these, close that one up, and delete and paste. So let's just change things up here. So maybe with this text, we can go a little darker of a treatment. But maybe that allows us to go a little brighter with the edge highlight. Now, with the extrusion shadow, there's another thing we haven't touched at all, which is the high alpha bright boost. It seems to brighten the colors, basically do a lightness change as the alpha channel changes. Now, another thing that we can do, and I think this is a really cool effect, is tying into the idea of how 3D Stroke actually draws its lines. 3D Stroke basically draws individual spheres, or you could think of them really as particles or sprites or whatever, individual spheres that are strung together, and they're strung together so tightly that it basically forms a line or a stroke. But we can spread those particles out simply by going to the advanced section and turning up the advanced step. We can start to turn these into individual dots rather than a stroke. So we could do this for the actual edge stroke itself, like that. In fact, we could probably thicken these up just a little bit. Now, we can also do this on the extrusion shadow. Let me pull up an example that I had worked with before. Now, this shadow is a little bit bright, but what I want to show you is if we go into the shadow itself and do that same thing where we spread those particles out, we can create some really interesting sort of particle-based or line-based shadow extrusion. So if I go into this advanced section here, so I've got this set to kind of a red, and you can see we've got a little bit of that hue rotation on it. What we can do is go into this adjust step for our shadows and turn this up. And we got to turn this up quite a bit, like over 1,000 to start to get these things spreading out. So now we get these really interesting kind of line shadows. Now again, encouraging you to think creatively and play with this. there's some things that we haven't even touched yet in 3D stroke, like the repetition rotation. Let's say I do a small amount of X rotation for the shadow. So I'll do like a negative rotation to make this kind of twist around as these repeat. Or we can add X or perhaps Y rotation to get these things kind of twisting around. Another thing we could do with this prism displacement is actually apply it to the text after we've applied the gradient. So if I go to displacement source on here and set it to that main text, we can actually start to distort it using that gradient and get kind of this almost metallic kind of effect. Now, playing on that idea, let's say we have something fairly thick like this. I'm going to use an image as a reflection map. This is actually from the Video Copilot Element 3D reflection texture collection. So I'll take that image and put it in here. Now, I've pre-composed this because the source image itself is 1024 by 512, which is pretty common for reflection textures. So let me just solo this text layer and the reflection texture, and I'll go to the reflection texture and apply prism displacement. I'll set that displacement just to the text, which in this case is called text precomp number 5. I'll set the source to use the alpha channel of that text, and probably turn down in terms of opacity. Let me set this to just a normal blended mode. There we go. So if I turn this down, this glass refraction, we can get some really interesting metallic textures or just simple reflection textures that we can add to this text. And I can punch out this matte here. And let's set the matte to be pulled from the text precomp. Or I can add this back into that text and blend it in to create kind of a reflective surface if we want. Run this down. Maybe add it with that card reflection that we added. Now, with something like this, it might actually help to darken the edges of that text. And I think the easiest way to do this, because there really isn't an effect to this that easily, is to go in to add an inner shadow using the layer style. So I can go into inner shadow. The size can be quite big as this text is pretty thick. Maybe just a little bit of distance on it, but this almost gives it that sort of subsurface scattering kind of effect with that darkening around the edges. So let's quickly talk about animating this stuff. Now, largely the way we've got this set up, this is mostly going to be sort of a 2D set of elements that kind of looks 3D, but don't expect to get a whole lot of camera movement out of this because we've pre-composed that text. These reflections here are actually using the pre-composed version of the text. So if we do place a camera and we start moving things around, you'll start to see your layers begin to separate. What I'd recommend if you really want some animation here is to simply keep all of your main text elements inside one comp and treat that sort of as a 2D element. But we've got all these different layers that go together to make up this text look, and if we animate them creatively, we can get some really interesting effects. So let's go to a version of this that has no keyframes and just kind of piece together an interesting animation for this. So when we've got lots of different elements like this, I think it's best to just kind of turn everything off except for one element and think about what we can do to animate this. So we've got these different layers stacked on top of each other. What I found to be most interesting, rather than going for the 3D stroke and animating the end points, which, well, you could do that, but I don't find that as interesting. I think actually animating the extrusion, sort of building it on, works pretty well. So we'll have this go fairly quickly. I'll have it end at the 2.5 mark and set a keyframe for the instances. Now, these basically build on top of each other, so there's no center point or anything. It just kind of starts from the first one and builds it forward, which I think is an interesting effect. So I'll set the number of instances to 0, and then we'll have this animate on. So this will just kind of build that extrusion on. Now I think what makes this more interesting, rather than having a linear keyframe like this, is to have it build quickly at first and have it slow to a stop. So let's go into our graph here, select that instances. Gonna take this, drag it down, or if you want, you could also just hit F9 for that and drag this back a little bit to really get this exaggerated velocity curve. Quick movement at first and then quickly comes to a stop. Let's jump on to the next one right here. We've got this 3-color ramp with a lighter color in the middle, which kind of makes it look like a reflection. So what I think we could do is just take these starting and ending points and create some animation for that. So we'll obviously have these end where they need to end, and then we'll work backwards from that. So I'll take these 2 points, we'll zoom out just a little bit, and move these up. I'm just going to kind of pick 2 spots up here, up above, and then I'll have this fade on quickly as those move in. So just do a simple opacity animation. Let's get rid of those linear keyframes. I think a simple ease in might work fairly well here. And just hitting F9 on that keyframe. Next, we'll have these reflections move in. So we will have these fade in to their final opacity, starting from 0. But right where they end, we'll set to position keyframes and have these move in. So I'm just going to take both of them and have them move in like this. Again, we're going to do some very exaggerated keyframe movement here. So let's F9. And for both of these layers, I have them both selected. Go in here, grab this influence and crank that all the way back. Okay, so let's do a quick preview of all of these. Okay, so that's most of the layers, and then we have the stroke edge here. So that we could just do a basic end stroke animation. So let's set a keyframe for that end and start that from 0. Ease that in. So because we've built these layers of different text effects that we can kind of mix together, you can time them and mix them together and do different types of animation to bring these on. I think it makes for a very interesting effect. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope this gives you some interesting ideas to try out on your own. Personally, I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I hope you enjoy playing with these ideas as well. My name's Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.